Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Inspiring Stories, where silence, strategy, and timing prove more powerful than words. Today's story takes us inside a courtroom where everything seemed stacked against Karoline Leavitt. She was interrupted, she was warned, and then she was handcuffed, right there on the witness stand. But just when it seemed like the judge had won, Pam Bondi stood up. No shouting, no theatrics, just one document. And from that moment, everything began to unravel. What happened next wasn't loud, it wasn't public, but it was powerful enough to end a career and restore Karoline's voice. So stay with us, because this is one of those moments you'll never forget. The courtroom was silent, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was sharp, tense, holding its breath. Outside, snow drifted against the steel and glass of Summit Heights Federal Courthouse, a soft contrast to the rigid tension inside Courtroom 3B. The air was dry, recycled, and heavy with unspoken accusations. At the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt, young, composed, absolutely still. On the surface, she appeared calm, but anyone paying attention could see the truth. Her clenched fingers, the tension in her jaw, the fire behind her eyes. She had already been interrupted twice while giving her testimony. She knew what was coming, but she also knew she wouldn't back down. Behind the bench, Judge Malcolm Travers adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. "Miss Leavitt," he said slowly, "I've warned you twice. If you interrupt these proceedings again, I will hold you in contempt." The words fell heavy, like stone. Karoline didn't move. "I'm stating the truth, Your Honor," she replied, voice steady. "If that's a problem, then maybe this courtroom has a bigger issue than I do." A murmur rippled through the gallery, a whisper, a gasp, just enough. Travers didn't flinch, but his pride did. Her attorney shifted forward, ready to intervene. Too late. The judge's gavel struck hard. "She's grandstanding, I will not allow it." Then colder, sharper. "Bailiff, escort Miss Leavitt into court custody. She is in contempt." For a second, the room fractured. No one moved. A clerk froze midway to the printer. A junior reporter dropped her pen. Even the bailiff hesitated, glancing sideways at the defense table, as if waiting for confirmation that this was really happening. Karoline moved first. Not to resist, not to argue. She simply stepped down from the witness stand, turned and placed her hands gently behind her back. The bailiff, still uncertain, fastened the cuffs with the delicacy of handling glass. Pam Bondi didn't flinch. Seated one row behind, Karoline's legal counsel, she calmly closed her folder, stood and stepped forward, composed, unshaken, carrying the weight of 1,000 courtrooms in her gaze. "Your Honor," Pam said, voice even, "we object to this ruling. My colleague and I have already filed an emergency stay regarding Miss Leavitt's detention." Travers raised an eyebrow. "No such stay has been recorded." Pam didn't break eye contact. "It has now." From her briefcase, she withdrew a crisp legal document and placed it in the clerk's hands. The courtroom clock ticked over to 10:57 a.m. Signed by Judge Aaron Halverson at 10:43 a.m., she said smoothly. The clerk scanned the page, eyebrows lifted. A whispered exchange with the judge. Travers stiffened. "We'll recess for 10 minutes, he muttered before disappearing through the judge's chambers. Karoline remained standing, hands cuffed, jaw locked. She hadn't spoken a word since the order, but she didn't need to. Pam stepped beside her and leaned in. "You're not going anywhere," she whispered. "He just made his first mistake." The gallery remained quiet, but behind notebooks and tablet screens, red recording lights flickered. A political blogger tapped furiously at a keyboard. One floor above, a staffer from the governor's office strode out of a side gallery, phone already to his ear. "Travers just tried to detain her," he said. Pam stopped it. They had a federal stay ready. He didn't see it coming. At the defense table, Karoline's lawyer sat frozen. The bailiff shifted uncertainly, glancing at the cuffs still locked around her wrists. Pam, however, remained perfectly still. She didn't gloat. She didn't even smile. She simply watched the courtroom shift, like a seasoned general watching a battlefield turn in real time. Karoline turned slightly. "You knew he'd try something like this." Pam nodded. "I didn't know. I was prepared." 10 rows back, Elena Moss, the journalist covering the trial, typed a simple phrase into her draft headline. She didn't blink, but the judge did. A white SUV with federal plates pulled into the secured parking lot. No sirens, no fanfare. Just quiet authority. Inside the courthouse, the tide was shifting, but only for those paying close attention. Outside, the storm had thickened. Snow swirled against the high windows of Summit Heights Courthouse, clinging to the glass like frostbitten fingertips. Inside courtroom 3B, the atmosphere remained frozen, but it wasn't the cold. It was the tension. Karoline Leavitt was still standing. The cuffs had been applied carefully, almost respectfully, but their meaning was brutal. Her hands weren't just restrained. They were being used as a message. Silence her. Shame her. Make an example of her. And yet she hadn't moved. Not a word. Not a tremble. The bailiff glanced over his shoulder, uncertain. He had never cuffed someone so still. Pam Bondi remained standing a few feet away, unshaken, her hands folded neatly over the printed emergency stay, a document that had already begun working its quiet magic. Upstairs, behind sealed chamber doors, Judge Malcolm Travers paced slowly in front of his desk. His legal assistant stood nearby, silent, watching. On the judge's desk, the federal order lay open, signed, time-stamped, legally binding. "How long ago was this filed?" Travers muttered. 10:43. "This morning, sir," the assistant replied. The judge didn't answer. He only exhaled slowly, lips thin, eyes cold. Downstairs, the courtroom doors swung open again. All eyes turned. Judge Travers returned to the bench, his steps measured, his expression composed. But something about him had changed. His posture was rigid, not regal, and for the first time since the hearing began, he didn't look at Karoline. "This court has reviewed the emergency order issued by U.S. District Judge Aaron Halverson," he began, voice carefully neutral. "The order places a temporary stay on any action related to contempt findings in this matter." The room didn't exhale, but it leaned forward. "Miss Leavitt will not be remanded into custody at this time. The order is binding, and this court will comply." Pam's expression didn't change. She remained calm, so calm that it unsettled more than one observer. This wasn't relief. It was confirmation. The bailiff stepped forward and uncuffed Karoline. She didn't rub her wrists. She didn't speak. She simply nodded once and returned to her seat, as if nothing had happened. The tension shifted, but it didn't leave. "We'll recess for 15 minutes, Travers announced, then stood and exited, faster this time. As the courtroom emptied into murmurs and movement, Pam turned slightly toward Karoline. "That's strike one," she murmured. Karoline glanced at her. "You really thought he'd try to jail me?" Pam shrugged softly. "I didn't think. I planned." A few rows behind them, a man in a charcoal suit stepped into the aisle. No badge, no nameplate, no visible affiliation. Just a leather folio tucked under his arm, and a gaze that had studied every micro-expression on Travers' face. He was from the Federal Judicial Oversight Division. And this wasn't the first time he'd been sent to observe Judge Travers. At the defense table, Karoline's lawyer let out a breath that had been trapped in his throat for 15 long minutes. That was close. Pam didn't even look at him. That was expected. In the hallway, journalist Elena Moss typed out a breaking news headline for the Summit Tribune. "Federal stay halts contempt order against Leavitt. Pam Bondi steps in." Across social media, the clip of Pam handing the document to the court clerk was already circulating. Silent but powerful. Upstairs, a federal case manager had already begun pulling Judge Travers' recent rulings for pattern review. Pam stood slowly, gathering her notes with quiet precision. She didn't look like someone who had just stopped an arrest. She looked like someone who had known it was never going to happen. As they stepped into the hallway, Karoline leaned in. If that stay hadn't been ready, but it was, Pam interrupted softly, firmly. On the other side of the courtroom, Ada Len Richter watched them both. His phone buzzed. 2 messages from the district's legal director. What the hell just happened? He didn't reply, because he knew what had happened. What he didn't know was what was coming next. Pam Bondi didn't look back as they walked through the doors. She didn't need to. She knew Judge Travers would. When he returned to the bench after recess, something in him had changed. Gone was the frustrated authoritarian of an hour ago. What replaced him was something colder, sharper, a man who had calculated the cost of overreaching and decided to take a different approach. The court will now proceed with the evidentiary portion of today's hearing, he said. His voice was smooth, too smooth, Pam Bondi noticed. Karoline shifted slightly in her chair but didn't speak. She'd seen this pivot before. When power couldn't punish you, it tried to erase you. Quietly. At the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Len Richter stood, exuding a calm confidence that hadn't been there earlier. The state calls Mr. Jonas Pratt, senior analyst for the Department of Labor Analytics. A man with a neatly trimmed beard and the weary demeanor of a statistician took the stand. Pratt swore in, adjusted his glasses, and settled into the witness chair. Mr. Pratt, Richter began, did you review the statements Miss Leavitt made during her interview on Capitol Circuit in February? Yes, I did. Were any of those statements inconsistent with federal labor projections? Yes, Pratt replied. Specifically, her projected job loss figures were inflated by approximately 38% compared to our published estimates. Karoline didn't blink. Her attorney made a note. Pam remained motionless. Her pen moved. Just a small tick across the margin of her file. The cross-examination was quiet. Methodical. Mr. Pratt, Karoline's attorney asked, are you aware of how Miss Leavitt's numbers were sourced? No, I am not. Could her figures have come from a regional model or a private forecast not reviewed by your department? It's possible, yes. So you're not claiming her numbers were false, just different? Correct. The gallery murmured. Pam slid a notepad across the table. One word was written in neat, controlled script. Nothing. But Travers wasn't watching. Pratt. He was watching Pam. And then came the real move. Your Honor, Richter said, turning. The state now calls Rachel Deming. Karoline stiffened, just slightly. Pam leaned back. Rachel Deming, a junior producer from the network that had hosted the interview, walked hesitantly to the stand. She looked young, anxious. Her hands fidgeted with a silver bracelet as she was sworn in. Miss Deming, Richter asked, were you present during the taping of Miss Leavitt's February interview? Yes, I was. Did you have any contact with her office before the interview? I was copied on a few scheduling emails. Did you receive any materials from outside political groups, talking points, advocacy briefs? No. So the messaging came exclusively from Miss Leavitt's team? Yes. Pam narrowed her eyes. The line of questioning seemed harmless. Too harmless. Did you notice any mention of campaign advisors in the communication? Rachel hesitated. I saw a name once. Just initials. It could have been anyone. Pam passed another note to Karoline's attorney. He's planting coordination. Soft implication. No substance. Cross-examination clarified everything. Miss Deming, did you or anyone on your team raise concerns about the integrity of the interview? No. Was Miss Leavitt's segment treated differently from any other political guest? No. Pam leaned slightly toward Karoline and whispered, he's losing ground. But don't get comfortable. He'll go off script. And he did. Before the next witness, Travers spoke. This court would like to review the timeline of events surrounding the interview. Karoline's attorney immediately stood. Your Honor, is this a new line of inquiry? Clarification. Travers replied, offering no further explanation. Pam's voice was calm, clear. We'll object if this line veers into areas covered by the federal stay. Travers looked at her for the first time that afternoon. I'm well aware of the stay's scope, Miss Bondi. The court clerk handed him a transcript. He read a line silently, then looked up. Miss Leavitt, did you have editorial control over your interview? No, but I approved my own statements. Were those statements reviewed by any campaign staff? Karoline shook her head. No. Pam slid one final note across the table. He's testing for intent. Campaign angle. Be ready. And then, Richter stepped back in. The state calls Julia Carnes, scheduling assistant for Citizens United PAC. Pam's eyes snapped toward the bench. Your Honor, she said, rising, we object to this witness. Her relevance has not been established, and she introduces an entirely new legal frame not previously disclosed. Travers hesitated. The courtroom hung in suspense. Objection sustained, for now, he said. Proceed carefully, counselor. Pam sat slowly. Karoline leaned in. What was that? Pam whispered. That was him testing the wire for voltage. No one noticed Pam Bondi leave the courtroom, while the prosecution reviewed notes and Judge Travers retreated to chambers for his next clarification. Pam quietly stepped through the side hallway, up 2 flights of stairs and into the federal administrative clerk's office. Pam carried a single folder. The clerk didn't ask for ID. He recognized her. This is in reference to an active proceeding under federal stay, she said. The envelope was slim, just 5 pages, but every word had been selected with surgical precision. The label read, Judicial Conduct Complaint, confidential, filed under seal, Pam added. No public disclosure unless ordered by the review panel. The clerk stamped the intake form, nodded, and placed the envelope in the secure tray behind the counter. He didn't ask questions. Pam didn't look back. Back in courtroom 3B, Judge Travers returned. He looked composed. Too composed. His hands were neatly folded, his robe perfectly straight. But something had changed. The force of command had left his voice. Now there was only strategy, control by suggestion. We will proceed to closing arguments, he announced, with the court noting the federal stay and its boundaries. ADA Len Richter stood first. His tone was lower than before, measured, almost sympathetic. He didn't speak of contempt or coordination anymore. Now he spoke of responsibility. Miss Leavitt's remarks contradicted federal data. Her platform gives her influence. This hearing is not about politics, it's about accountability. Careful, clever. Pam watched him closely. She said nothing. Not yet. The courtroom, once tense and reactive, had become quiet. Too quiet, like the space between lightning and thunder. Now it was their turn. Pam rose. Your Honor, she said, the defense will split closing remarks. I will speak. First, Travers gave a small nod. He didn't interrupt her this time. Pam stepped into the well. No slides, no performance, only presence. This hearing, Your Honor, has not been about fact versus fiction. It has been about process. Whether the steps taken against Miss Leavitt followed legal, ethical, and procedural standards. Her voice was calm, slow. The numbers presented by the defense were sourced from regional labor projections, publicly available, peer-reviewed, and released weeks prior to her interview. She paused. If those numbers differ from federal data, that is a policy discussion, not a legal violation. No evidence has been shown of manipulation, coordination, or intent. Every sentence was clipped, deliberate. Pam stepped back. Karoline's lead counsel followed with a brief technical summary of the labor model, citing comparative precedent from 2 other states. When he finished, no one moved. Judge Travers cleared his throat. This court will recess. A ruling will be issued at 3 p.m. He stood, left again. Pam sat slowly. Karoline leaned over. He's not reacting. Is that good? Pam gave a subtle shake of her head. It means he doesn't know who's watching yet. 30 minutes later, in a small office 1 floor above, a federal ethics officer opened the complaint Pam had filed. She hadn't added commentary. She didn't need to. The document spoke for itself. Timeline of Travers' rulings in the case. direct contradictions of state procedural law, objections overruled without cause, language that mirrored known biases from past cases, a pattern, context, silence, no speculation, just the record. Downstairs, Karoline stepped into the hallway. Her press aide handed her a phone. Dozens of missed messages, press requests, quotes, appearances. She didn't reply to any of them. "Let it breathe," she said. At 2:59 p.m., the courtroom filled again, not packed, but watched. Half the observers were attorneys from other departments, suddenly interested in how Travers would close this. When he entered, he didn't look at the defense table. He adjusted the mic, unfolded a single sheet, and read, "This court finds that while the statements in question differ from federal estimates, no deliberate misrepresentation or coordinated misconduct has been established." A wave of breath passed through the room. But he wasn't done. However, the court expresses concern with the tone and approach taken by Ms. Leavitt during testimony. This court expects all participants, regardless of position, to maintain a standard of decorum. Pam stood. "Your Honor, that concern was previously addressed and dismissed under the federal stay. It should not be included in your concluding statement." Travers didn't meet her eyes. "This is not a ruling. It's a closing note." Then he left. Just like that. Karoline turned to Pam. "Is that it?" Pam exhaled. "For him?" "Yes." Upstairs, the federal clerk signed the complaint into the review docket. Complaint 22 FC, and just like that, it was out of his hands. At precisely 3:30 p.m., the courtroom settled into a stillness that felt less like waiting and more like judgment. The spectators who remained understood. This was no longer about a labor statistic. It had become something larger: authority, reputation, and whether the system still worked when no one was shouting. Judge Malcolm Travers entered, a file in hand. His black robe, once a symbol of weight and authority, now hung from his shoulders like an ill-fitting costume. He moved with practiced composure, though his hands betrayed a slower, more deliberate pace. Adjusting the microphone, he avoided eye contact with the defense table. Karoline Leavitt sat upright, hands folded, her notes untouched. Her gaze never wavered from the bench. Beside her, Pam Bondi remained motionless, her folder closed, her pen unused. Travers cleared his throat. "This court has reviewed all testimony, exhibits, and final statements presented over the last 2 days." He flipped a page, hesitated. While the hearing addressed a legitimate concern regarding the public communication of economic data, the court finds no evidence of deliberate falsehood, coordinated messaging with outside groups, or intent to mislead. A breath passed through the room. Not relief, but release. Something long held now quietly let go. Therefore, no formal sanction or disciplinary action will be pursued. Karoline didn't move. Pam didn't smile. But they both knew this wasn't a ruling. It was a retreat. Yet Travers wasn't finished. He shifted slightly in his chair. However, the court notes with concern the tone and approach demonstrated during Miss Leavitt's testimony. Regardless of background, decorum remains an expectation. "In this courtroom," Pam responded, not with anger but precision. "Your Honor, as noted, any reference to conduct covered by the federal stay was already deemed outside the scope of these proceedings." Her voice was calm, legal, bulletproof. Travers nodded. "This is a closing statement, not a judgment." Then, without another word, he stood and exited through the chamber doors. He didn't look back. The gavel had fallen, not with thunder, but with surrender. Outside, snow still fell. A few reporters lingered, but most were already writing their headlines. Elena Moss, notebook in hand, approached Karoline. "Any comment, Miss Leavitt?" Karoline gave a polite nod. "No further remarks today." No victory speech, no spike of the football. That was the difference. Pam didn't follow immediately. Instead, she moved purposefully up the back staircase, entering the federal judicial clerk's office. There she handed over a final envelope. Amendment, Addendum, Complaint, 22 FC 1119. Inside, a summary timeline, exhibit citations, and a copy of Trevor's verbal concerns. Post-stay, filed and sealed, she said. The clerk scanned the header, nodded, and entered it into record. Next step, preliminary review completion. Pam didn't stay for small talk. She turned and walked away. Downstairs, Karoline waited by the front exit. When Pam approached, she didn't ask questions, she only said, "Is that what I think it is?" Pam nodded. The system has rules. We followed them. Now it has to decide if it wants to follow itself. 3 days later, the press release went out. The matter concerning Miss Leavitt's February remarks has been resolved. No further action will be taken. We thank our legal counsel for their diligence and professionalism. No mention of Trevor's. No mention of the stay. Just closure. Pam reviewed it herself. Clean. Discreet. Exactly right. Let silence carry the story, she said. And it did. 1 week later, Judge Travers received an internal notice. Conduct complaint. 22 FC 1119 preliminary review complete. Next step, voluntary response or administrative escalation. He read the document twice. Then he folded his hands and waited. No press conference, no statement. 2 weeks later, without warning, Travers submitted his resignation. Effective immediately, I will conclude my tenure on the bench. I remain proud of my years of service. No farewell ceremony, no reporters in the hallway, only quiet. Back in New Hampshire, Karoline returned to work. She made no mention of the hearing, no claim of victory. She focused on policy. Her press secretary asked, "Should we say anything about the resignation?" "No," Karoline said. "Let the record speak." Pam Bondi, meanwhile, was already reviewing a new case file in her D.C. office when the email arrived. Complaint resolved. No further comment required. She forwarded it to Karoline's attorney with a simple subject line, "Matter closed." And that was all. In legal circles, a quiet blog post made its rounds. Its title was simple, "The Limits of Power." When the gavel meets the law, it didn't name Travers, or Karoline, or Pam, but the final line said everything. In the end, it wasn't argument or outrage that won, it was knowing the rules and using them better.